compassion and care is something that changes the standard of the bar and raises and lowers that frequency. Totally. Whether we don't care or care too much can completely change the landscape of what we collectively experience as the bar.
Wow.
I think that's a really good framework.
Compassion being a linchpin.
It really is a linchpin.
Wow.
Nice.
Wow.
It's like in the grenade of it all. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Ian.
I'm Patrick.
I'm Chris.
And we're the Fate Boys. Woo! All right, what are we talking about today,
Awesome.
Chris?
So our topic for today is, the question is, how low can you go? So that came up from you and I talking about the bar, and it's like, well, what does that mean? Like standards, which kind of, and then talking about morality, and then even like standards, and maybe even like you could throw in the word virtues around, like
Values.
Like, is it better to have them versus not? And like something rather than nothing? And like, because that bar can seem really subjective, but it's also, you know, we're talking about fate and all that stuff, and it's like I feel like in all our conversations we bring in a concept about like a higher principle or a higher guide post. And so
how to lead a skillful life.
Yeah, and so that's where, like, you know, I brought up my opinion on how it's actually better to have something rather than nothing. But we can explore that together.
Well, that's what we're going into.
But I know you had something to say around privilege, and we have a little bit different views on that.
Yeah, let's go into it. Let's dive on in. So for me, I want to just speak to the fact, when I talk about the bar of a standard, I think the fact that I've had some privilege in my life of being brought up in the United States, being male, being white.
Could you define privilege for us?
I mean, privilege, by definition, in my view, in my definition of it, is something that I personally haven't experienced as either a shortcoming or a struggle, or something that I've never even had to consider that someone else has. So I don't know what it's like to grow up in the slums of Mumbai. You know, like, I don't know what that life looks like. I don't know what it looks like to
be a woman.
I don't know what it looks like to be a person of color. Like, I don't have that as a lived experience. Yeah. And so there is a privilege of me not having had that experience, to never have to think about the things that people who have had those experiences have had to overcome. And so when I'm saying in relationship to this topic about the bar, the privilege is a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
Like, we're going to have a whole episode.
Get into that.
Well, I just want to ask. I want to ask something around that, though, because you're acknowledging it as some form of, like, you feel this inner necessity to acknowledge it, and it's always like looking to the lower, supposedly. But what does that mean to the higher? Does that change your perspective? Like someone that has more privilege? Like, how do you feel about that?
Well, I think people who, quote unquote, have more privilege than others, I think that
you specifically.
For sure, than me specifically. I think people who have more privilege than me, I wouldn't say necessarily, the obligation that I would put on them is just to acknowledge, the same way that I do going the other direction, is to acknowledge that they have something that I don't. They have the privilege of not having to have thought about it. If somebody who's never had to have the thought of scraping through the seat cushions of their couch to find change to pay for food because they've always had money, there's a certain level of privilege to that. But when we're talking about the bar, coming back to this idea of the bar, what I'm talking about is, what is the standard that we as a society hold ourselves to? And for me, when I'm talking about it, I'm thinking about it from the perspective of, I go out in the world and I see, like, the bar is so much lower than I think it is in my head.
Where do you notice that in your daily life?
I notice that when I'm at a store. I notice that when I, like, returning the shopping cart is a perfect analogy.
Totally.
In my idea, is this like this idea of If I go to a store, I'm shopping, I'm using a cart. If I walk back outside, I'm not just going to tip it up on its side in the middle of the
You don't
parking
do that?
lot. Yeah, yeah, right. I'm going to return it. I don't necessarily walk it all the way back in, but I put it next to the receptacle, and that's having a standard of a bar of we as a society, as a collective, has said, hey, this is the interaction that we have deemed acceptable.
Ooh, here an example.
Yeah,
Not littering.
Littering. Great. That's a great topic. Yeah. So it's like, I think that is not a great idea to just finish a cheeseburger and then toss the wrapper into the wind. I don't think that as a standard, I think that in standard morals, virtues, these things, I think that is something to not do.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think that in our life, and where this conversation kind of spawned from, which was really juicy, which is why we decided to do a cast on it, was this idea, in my mind, I hold myself to such a high standard or a higher bar that it makes me somewhat judgmental of other people not having that same standard. And so I ask myself, well, why do I have that? Why do I have that judgment of myself and others?
Sure.
Right? It's like holding myself to the standard, like, is that important? Is that something that's valuable? You know?
I'm sensing two important points that can fit inside of this topic, which is common sense, having common sense in your environment and how you're interacting.
That's a great one, too.
And then common courtesy, I feel like, is what Ian is really dancing around and diving into from these various angles.
But even calling it common sense or common decency
There
is
it
interesting
is.
because there's already
There
an
it is.
implication that that's the bar.
Right.
Right? You're,
Right.
like, you're
Well-
setting it at a level like, yeah, of course you're not going to slap your mom in the face for putting too
I hold the
much salt
door
in
open
food.
for somebody behind me.
Yeah.
I haven't studied it immensely. I can't remember, but I remember you talk around, what I forget. It's one of those earlier Enlightenment philosophers around the social contract, right? Like when we're born into a social contract that exists already, but it's kind of like
Confucius was big on that.
where does the social contract kind of stem from or evolve? And my ideas around like collective consciousness is probably it's a conglomeration of each individual's bar, and then there's like this normally it seems like it's a lowest common denominator.
Yeah.
And so,
Yes.
right, because you have a really high standard, and maybe your judgment potentially could come from trying to validate your own bar, right? Like,
I mean, potentially, I think this is intrinsic to every human being. I think we can only see from our own perspective.
Right.
Of our own lived experiences. And then if you've had enough space to be able to become aware of that perspective, then you can start to garner some objectivity of looking at it from the position of the other.
And that's where when like your view on privilege, like the way I kind of see it is, I think everyone has the capacity, if they so choose to, or there's like an understanding for me personally around, there's always someone that's going to have it better, and there's always going to be someone that has it worse.
Sure.
And they like to say comparison is a thief of joy, and I totally believe that.
I agree, and I don't want to cut you off, but I'm going to. So
Fight you.
it's the thing that I love to say to that point as well is like suffering is suffering. People like to do comparative suffering all the time, and
That's where it gets real sticky.
It gets real sticky because it's like pain is pain, suffering is suffering.
Yeah.
Like a 5-year-old dropping their ice cream, they're losing their world
Losing
is
their minds.
shattered. Absolutely, it's ice cream. It doesn't really matter, but to that kid, it's like in the moment that's horrible. But you said something there which I really liked is that it's the lowest common denominator, and I think that's really where this conversation kind of spawned from. Is the bar is the lowest common denominator that we as a society, as a culture, as a group have agreed upon as like this is where it lies, and and there are people who are below it, and there are people that are above
Well, and that's where there's like a difference between passive agreement and conscious agreement. Like I think a lot of it is passive agreement. Like it's just the way things
it. So
are.
give me an example from your life where you've experienced that.
Well, like growing up, like in Spain, there's kind of just that people don't always ask for help or directions because there's just this inherent sense of like you're just supposed to know. And it's not something that I go around thinking like I just supposed to know. It's almost like you pick up on it from the environment you're in and
100%.
people's attitudes. So I'm passively agreeing to kind of act in accordance with that cultural standard, if you will, and like I might not agree with it, but then that's where I have to make a conscious choice, and I think that's when the bar starts being elevated almost naturally. Like you have to continue to hold yourself accountable, and that's where I think like the conversation around like virtues come in, is like the lowest common denominator is normally like a subconscious passive acceptance of what's been given to you. But and then the bar is raised only when you take ownership. It's kind of like when we talk about fate versus destiny. It's like fate's what's given to you. Destiny is when you
what you choose from it. Yeah.
grab it by the cojones.
So passive and active. I'm seeing maybe a lead into the values and standards and our idea of the bar based on where our family brought us up. You mentioned Spain. I grew up far up north, in a lot of time spent up north, northern Midwest, and like the values are very old fashioned up there, whereas somebody from a different part of the country might be totally different,
More progressive.
Totally. So I'm seeing that as maybe a relative, maybe more passive cultivation of a value system inherently, and then real virtues. You mentioned virtues. Those to me ring as timeless. Something that is inherently like the highest potential of human expression, like virtues being kind and compassionate to your neighbor and don't kill people and things like that every human being in a sense should get. We're getting into like 10 Commandments type stuff.
Sure.
Now, right?
Well, yeah, and then it ties into like the importance and where does religion or spirituality play within the cultural development of the society.
I just wanted to open that can of
Well,
worms.
sure.
that goes back to this like concept of individual versus collective, and so
Great point.
Yeah.
I think what the conversation that we're having here breaks it down into two pieces, right? Two places, because we're saying the bar collectively versus an individual bar, an individual standard.
And the tension inherent in that
To
dissonance.
me, right. I think the bar itself is the collective that we're measuring it against.
Okay.
Right,
yeah.
and so I would
Yes.
I would put that out there. I'd throw
Yes.
that little tidbit out
For
there
terms, yeah.
For terms to say is like when we're referring to the bar in this equation or this calculation, this conversation, the bar is that collective, and then your own relationship to it. So for me, I definitely see myself above what societal standards of the bar is, or doing these types of things. I feel that I hold myself to a higher standard. Not that I'm better than other people, but that's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that for myself, I notice that collectively we say that this is an acceptable behavior to leave your cart just tipped over into the parking lot. Versus for me, I will take it back and I'll return it to the place where it needs to go.
So that, to bring it to your personal experience then, like maybe either how or why or both do you have that bar, and where did you get it? And where did you start, or did you develop it, or like what?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a developed thing. So as I was growing up, the way that I've experienced my life is it goes, and psychologically you can see this as like children's development, is you start with yourself, then you start with your family, then you go to like maybe like a soccer team or your school, and then you go to your city, community, then you go to your state, you go to your country, you go bigger. And or your church, if you're related to like a church congregation or something like that. You have an identity associated with these different things, but you always start with yourself.
Your circle of influence.
Yeah, exactly. So I would say that for me, it came from my parents, obviously. It came from an area where I live in the world. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado area, so it's relatively progressive and thinking about others, while simultaneously there is still that American mindset of pull yourself up by the bootstraps. If you're not doing so well, then figure it out kind of mentality as well. So I was also put into a position where I was supported by my community and my family, relatively well off, had a lot of privilege in that, and was able to, by having those conditions, not to say that that's the only way that you develop these things, but for me, I was presented with the opportunity to, and coaching and challenge of quote unquote acting right and doing the right thing, holding the door open for people, those types of those actions.
Courtesies.
Which kind of goes to like, well, what makes it right?
Great,
And
absolutely.
then, but
yeah.
really before that question, as you were talking, and and then even surrounding privilege, but even maybe not even touching on that aspect is like, you're like, oh, I grew up in Boulder with like this higher society. Where did that higher society come from? Like, how did those people like right? Because we're like, especially when you bring in privilege, and I feel like we have maybe slightly different views on that. Is like,
sure. Excited for that cast.
You're accepting that like they have this higher standard and maybe like there's a higher value
from where the bar is. And so that's the other caveat that I really just kind of want to supplant there is like when we're talking about where the bar is lower than that standard. And so there's like a collective standard that Boulder, Colorado holds itself to the nation, for example.
That's why I moved out here.
Yeah, that's why a lot of people move here. Yeah. So I think Colorado has an interesting thing, and that's not to say all of Colorado, right? Like if I go to Greeley, like I'm gonna have a completely different experience than if I'm in Aurora or if I'm in
the Springs,
Colorado Springs, or Manatee. You just came from Manatee. You just did the incline, right?
Yes.
Fun.
How are your legs feeling?
Decent, but for some reason my hips and maybe my upper glutes are a little bit.
I think from stepping, because when you step and you push up,
like,
it's all that lower back.
Yeah, and I was just like, I wish I had the poles.
Yes, you could pull.
I was just like pushing up on my thighs to get up the next step. But
Manatee Springs versus Boulder, holy crap, that's a completely different divergent like group of people. Now, is the bar between those two places when we're talking about where their bar is that the same? And like what constitutes the evaluating factors of what adds up to be the bar?
Well, that's where I think maybe it's good to go into like that conversation around like standards or even like virtues versus none, right? Like which feels like it's going to be a separate subject, but I feel like there's only so much we can say about the bar before it's like the subjective, like, because there's then with the concept of privilege, it just kind of goes to the value. And well, the thing I'll say about that is, the way I see it is like people hate, especially in more modern like society, people hate the concept of pyramids and hierarchies, and it's like it's all bad, and we're all equal and it's all kumbaya. But like actually, and I think that comes because people project or have this sensation around where your place is on the hierarchy is your value, and
that there's a superiority to it.
Yeah,
I don't think that there's, in the way that you're describing it, there's no superiority.
But and if we're gonna go like old school, right? Yeah. Like whether it's the CEO or the king or the president, especially like in the U.S., we're always like, oh, we need to vote the right president because he's going to save our lives. And it's like we're putting all this power into this one person at the top. So we are already equating like they're more valuable in some way than...
Or they have a superior sense of morality.
Yeah, and so that goes to like, power, responsibility. But that his value is higher in the sense of as a human being. Yeah. It just means he's accepted more responsibility. And so... his function on the pyramid or in the hierarchy is to actually benefit the greater lower portion. And so
if they're acting from that place of morality and value and virtue and all of those things, if you're holding that to be true, then I would agree with you. I think like your acknowledgement of modern versus older, which like is different, because I think that there used to be, or I would say that was more true then, when people heavy hangs the crown, so to speak, on the person with the majority of the authority. Because if I was in a war, like being the general in that situation, I can't imagine that level of pressure to be like, okay, you 1,000 guys go do that. Bomb goes off, they all die. That was my call.
But you accepted that.
I accepted that as that role in that charge. Like that weight of that. Holy shit. Like, obviously, if you're one of the 1,000, you're dead now. So, but like...
And I think the last thing I wanted to say around this was just back to bring it to the bar is like the subjectivity, that part of maybe why the bar is so low is because we as a society, as a collective, have really become incredibly selfish. And so it's all about me.
Yeah.
And so
in American society specifically.
And in the me, there's no contrast or trying to root it in reality, because what we claim as reality is this our subjective opinion about our experience, instead of having like looking for like that archetypal energy of like what's the truism that's true for all things, not just for me.
My experience.
Yeah. So I think what you both are pointing toward right now is really important to touch on morality, responsibility, and how power fits into that. Because morally, if we're talking about someone at the top of that pyramid, you don't just get the power that comes at the top of the pyramid. You have to accept responsibility in proportion to that power if we're going to live in a moral society, right? And yeah, you're talking about the general who has to make those insanely high-level calls.
Right.
And if you're doing something for the greater moral good, you have to accept the responsibility of exercising that power and the consequences of it.
Right.
And Chris, you touched on, if you're going to hold yourself to a moral standard, what is that rooted in? It's not just reality. What's making up that reality is a field of values. And I think where America runs into trouble in the postmodern age is we're discovering, especially you see it in Gen Z, they're floating around like everything's relative. And do I become a nihilist if everything's relative? I have nothing to lean on. And we're discovering right now that you could say it's a spiritual hole, void in our society, but what we're really looking at is an absence of a field of values that we can all agree on as important and potent.
How does that show up for you in your personal life?
Okay, thank you.
That feels juicy.
I would say that when I was really young, I grew up with a single mom in Indianapolis, Indiana, and she did the best that she could, but there was very little framing and framework of how do I orient myself in a skillful way to get my needs met, pursue joy, be safe. And, acknowledging privilege is my father was very well off, not in the house though, lived far away and would protect and provide from afar. And growing up with my mom, my dad's care and protection didn't always make it to me through my mom. And I love her very much. But there was so much chaos and instability and lack of masculine influence growing up for me to root myself in, to be able to meet her and meet life in the most skillful way that I could. So what I discovered is with lack of framework, I just was bumping into shit all the time as a young boy and no healthy food in the fridge. So my first foray into developing a value system came through health and fitness. When I went from being a skinny, 6-year-old to all of a sudden I was huge as a young person and not getting picked for sports and feeling self-conscious for the first time in my life and recognizing that everyone else had more energy than I did and da-da-da. So I had to create a standard.
Right.
Even without knowing.
A personally developed one,
That was my first foray into developing a value system was one day, and I remember the day, it was in middle school, and I decided, enough of this shit. I'm tired of being tired all the time. I'm tired of feeling self-conscious. I'm tired, you're hitting puberty and you're not getting any success with girls as you would in middle school. But I was like, I need to do something even though I don't know what I'm doing. So I'm just going to eat fruits and veggies and all the stuff. And I had to inform my mom and my friends when I would go over to their house because other people did not have to make those same decisions. When I was that young, my friends did not necessarily have the same genetics that I did, so they could get away with eating whatever they wanted and still be skinny, right?
It's I think 10th, 11th grade, I became vegetarian, and then it's that's outside the norm, and then it's you said, you have to kind of inform people, because and then it's oh wow,
I'm not going to drink soda. Don't make it weird.
Well, it's also interesting you were talking about
offering it to me, bro.
That you were talking about feeling you had no guideposts, because I was also thinking while you were talking about that is oftentimes in society we have we pick up on things whether it's more subconsciously or just programming, whether it's from our parents or society about how to approach life, and they're just tough it out, but and then you try to double down on I'm just gonna tough it out, and then you suffering. And so I think the threshold of pain is kind of what and everyone has a different threshold of pain where you say enough is enough. And
Yeah.
It's a different
fortunately, at a younger age, as hard as it can seem, it's like probably better, right? That goes into like, is it better to have nothing or something? Is like, I think it's better to have something and then put it to the test, and then ideally you reach your threshold of pain with what doesn't work.
And when you're saying put it to the test, you're talking about putting your principles and values.
Well, just in your life, like you're living life. Like a girlfriend breaks up with you, how are you going to deal with it? Your, friend dies, like whatever, something really harsh. How do you deal with it? Do you apply the principles that society has given you and your parents have given you,
or that you have none,
have none, and then you're like, you're like,
society's giving you some, sure.
And I think like the undercurrent of this whole portion of what we were talking about is really like, why do standards matter? Mm-hmm. Can we dive into that a little bit?
Sure. Do you want to hit us with the definition of the standards and morals that you found earlier?
Yeah.
Because those are really great.
Here, I've got them pulled up. So let's start with morality. The definition of morality that I found that feels really resonant and true is principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior. So morality is speaking to more of the behavioral aspect of life.
Okay.
Standards are a level of quality or attainment. That's the basic definition. I think that there's a lot that you could dive into with standards. Privilege, I also defined just because we're in this conversation.
Yeah.
That is defined as a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group.
Immunity.
I really liked that framework of it.
Yeah.
And yes, I know. We're going to save it. We're going to save this juice.
Yeah.
Episode 4.
And then the final one that I
5,
found is a definition of virtues, which is behavior showing high moral standards. So it's interesting that virtues and morality.
There's an interconnect. I really like that.
Yeah.
We're saying like morality is kind of a binary, where it's kind of like good, bad,
Right.
Yeah.
And then
virtues kind of show.
Standard is the quality of good, bad.
So it's
How
almost
good.
like the
Right?
object.
How good,
bad.
how bad. So you
And then
start to get a quality level rating on this, and now it starts to get into more of a gray scale. So you have black, white, and then now you're starting to add gray hues in between.
50 shades of that.
Right, 100%. And
virtue's like the application.
And then virtue, say the virtue one again.
Behavior showing high moral standards.
How do you apply it? So then you have black and white, you have gray, and then how do you paint? So I think
Beautiful.
the virtues is like, okay, here's the brushes that I'm using with the different levels, and I can keep high contrast, right? I can just be all black, all white, and just say
A
like
little more fundamentalist, if you will.
sure, and then just rigid on that moral guidepost, where just like I will not be anything other than this one side.
The ends never justify the means.
Period.
Full stop.
Yeah, and then you start to talk about standards. And then now you're saying like, well, I can understand given that situation and conditioning why you would have that particular way of thinking around the world. Now you start to have a little bit of a give and take where there's a little bit of more nuance associated with it. And then the virtue of it, to me, is more altruistic in that like I'm applying it now to something, and also that's where you get to test it. Like you're saying, like, how do I test out this?
Yeah, because I was thinking about like, there's so much, in the news and in politics and just like social movements. It's like everyone's pointing the finger, and I think it's because they get stuck in morality. It's like, I'm a Christian, so my morality is
the
this.
black and white.
You're an atheist, so your morality is that. But yeah, I'm thinking why morality I don't think is inherently like a bad thing at all. I think it's good to have a sense of morality.
Sure.
I agree.
But I like how we're connecting it, because it seems like it will only be a virtue when you apply it. And so...
And have an understanding of where you are on that standard.
Or almost that you
How
can
you're
see if
applying
the standard is virtuous by the sake of how you're testing it.
Yeah.
Because
How does
otherwise morality is purely subjective, good and bad. Like,
100%.
and I mean, I would maybe argue that there's ways to like, it's not rooted in like a sciencey approach, but like, I think if we all tap in, we have kind of a sense that is transcendental.
And I really like that you brought up the tapping in, because I feel like up to this point we've been talking about the external idea of morality, where it's coming from the top down perhaps, or from the outside in, you know, where we grew up, our religious
Those are
or
factors.
not
Sure.
religious upbringing, and all of this good stuff. And then as we mature, hopefully, we start to feel, I'll use I statements here, I have begun to feel in more recent years the internal pressure of like, hey, you need to raise your standards. Why? Because I'm not satisfied subjectively and objectively with how my life is manifesting.
Internally. Yeah,
Yes, internally, my subjective experience is not measuring up to my conception of where I would like my life to be.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think having that awareness and being able to think about, and it's interesting. So tying it back to kind of what you're saying in your experience, because I've also had to deal with being overweight as a kid.
Totally.
And judging myself against the litmus or the quote unquote bar of what is acceptable or is perceived as being acceptable. And there are qualifications, I would say, that you can say that are objectively true. Like if you're morbidly obese, you're putting your organs under more stress.
You want to be healthy.
And that is not healthy.
Right.
And so, but that doesn't mean that I am not worthy of love or acceptance in society or any of those types of things. And then also tying into your piece too, Chris, when you're saying, well, being vegetarian and having to alert people and pre-warn them like, hey, I don't eat that, thanks. There's also no requirement for society to adjust to my standard or my way of being in the world. So like being 400 pounds and being on an airplane, where's the requirement of the airplane company to make seats for 400-pound people when that's not the average? Like, do they have a responsibility? I don't think so. Personally, I don't.
I'd agree.
I think that they don't have a responsibility to do that because of what they're setting as their standard.
That also begs the question, like, if they started putting enough seats, would more people naturally go to the lower denominator and more 400-pound people?
So I think that there's an interesting aspect of things falling down to a certain level of like the lowest common denominator. That's why they say it's the lowest common denominator. Let's go down to the root of where that denominator is. But there's the piece, just to kind of tie it back into what I was saying, is there's a piece of personal responsibility, and there should be some acknowledgement that exists.
Yeah, because I wanted to ask you guys, like, what's your understanding of, right, where you're, like I said, a threshold of pain? Because, like, you know, you're talking about, like, your circumstances and this and that, but, like, you're also an individual, and so you, like, what is your understanding around what and how, or I don't know if I'm asking this totally correctly, created you to want to even have a higher bar? Like,
great question.
And like, you're like, okay, I'm ready to start doing something different.
So, I mean, we can tie it back into like a theological question of like, what's the purpose of suffering? Like from like a Buddhist perspective, like all suffering, all life is suffering, right? And to exist, you are putting yourself against the world, which intrinsically is combative. And so you're going to encounter individual levels and degrees of suffering. And I think where the threshold becomes acceptable for that person and where that pressure, like coal turning into diamonds, like when does that metamorphosis occur? So having been a personal trainer for a lot of years, having gone through my own weight loss journey, having gone through my own health, and I used to be what's the word? I used to have body dysmorphia. I used to be, when I was 15, I weighed 253 pounds, and it was like 5'9", I think at the time, and so heavy. But when I was like 6'7", I was big boned, but I wasn't heavy. And so I was going through all this emotional turmoil. My parents were getting divorced, single mother household thing. My life felt like it was devolving. I was very angry all the time, going into puberty and just like not having a good way to like manage my emotional body. And so by going through that pressure, by going through that trauma or going through that struggle, I had to learn coping strategies. I had to learn how to navigate my emotional state. I needed to learn about how to manage my weight and manage my health at an earlier age, because I had friends who could just eat a pizza and like not put on a pound. I'm like, fuck you. Like that was just ridiculous.
They didn't have to hold the same standards.
They didn't have
as
to
you.
have it because it's just like they didn't run up against that pressure, that struggle, that pain.
Yeah.
And I feel grateful now as an adult, having gone through that earlier, because I know people in their 50s who haven't gone through that,
Right.
and they seem to have like still not figured it out, so to speak. And so for me to have to grapple with that stuff earlier, I feel like I have an advantage in my life. Not to any other person, but to myself, I have an advantage, a leg up on that, because I've had to learn those types of strategies and those types of ways of being, self-worth and capability, and it allows me to feel more complete and actualized in my experience of what I'm doing here.
You're
Versus
more empowered because you
Right.
took the wheel of your
I
life.
took control of my situation and not allowing that to define me. But when I was dealing with body dysmorphia, I was 175 pounds, 6'2", 6'1".
You were lean and mean.
Like 7% body fat, and I still felt like I was 253. I look at myself in the mirror and I still hated myself. I still didn't feel comfortable in my body. And it took me about 2.5 years of being that weight of like 175 to 195 to allow it to like wash over me. That's no longer my reality.
Right.
But I can commiserate with people who struggle to not see the reality in front of their face, who like when they feel that way in their body and they're not doing the inner work to figure out to like heal, to allow that to like recover, and they just keep perpetuating the same narrative, the same story, the same pain.
Yeah.
And they're not growing through the pain. They're just continually like washing in the wheel of that samsara.
You're talking about you brought up Buddhist, and that's why I was like, yeah, the attachment to the pain, that you got so used to feeling like shit for being overweight that even when you were young, like...
And self-hatred, like really hating myself.
You're like, oh wow, I gotta
sure.
hold on to this.
Yeah.
You obviously saw some value in there for your attachment to suffering, which is...
That was the key to me losing weight at the beginning.
Yeah.
Was for me to recognize that, like I use that pain and that self-hatred as a spur, as a motivator.
Totally.
Right? So it's like they have the like carrot versus the stick analogy. It was all stick.
Yeah, same.
There was no the carrot at the end of the road was like, I'll get to my goal eventually, but what's the driver?
David
It's not me
Go-
chasing the thing
It's
I
like
want.
David Goggins. He's
Yeah.
all stick, no carrot.
Yeah.
Oh my
you know,
gosh.
Yes, you have your fingers crossed.
I do. So just a quote that I found that feels really relevant to what you're saying, and I think that this will feed into what you're feeling too. It's without standards, there can be no improvement. There's no progression without holding ourselves accountable
What's
Right.
calling
to
you
these standards and
forward.
values that we set for ourselves without societal pressure. And that's, I think, a part of the man or boy to man phenomena as well, is like we then take on our own personal standards
Yes.
and
It's
what
not-
that means for us and what we
Totally.
hold value to.
And that there's an accountability piece to that. I think the sooner anyone can take back control of their own story, of their own faith, if you'll
There it
want to
is.
say,
Boom.
Fate.
of their own destiny, is being able to, the sooner they can do that, the better off you'll be ultimately. And I'll, again, speaking from my own experience, like when I stopped blaming other people for my
Yeah.
situation, and I then turned at, I'm also a Scorpio, so I know this type of like self-damnation type of negative talk all the time, and I had to heal through that too, of recognizing that all stick all the time wasn't a healthy way to live life.
Right.
And like, what am I living for? You know, like what am I actually like?
Where's the joy?
Where's the joy? Like,
Yeah.
what, okay, like you get all the goals you want in the world, but like, what's the bedrock of how you
Yeah.
feel? In
When are
your
you gonna
body?
love
And
yourself?
that's
Yeah,
where I
right,
wanted to
yeah.
bring in, like, what's in her definition was great, but like, what's the point of improvement? Like, because it seems like so many people can just coast along on that low bar.
I want to bring up one thing, and then I want to hear a personal story from Chris, because we haven't heard about
I know.
maybe Chris's
I've been ready.
standards from earlier in
We've
your
heard
life.
about
Yeah.
Spain and
Yeah.
and not people asking for directions. But
I want to.
It's hard out in these streets.
I want to jump off of Eden's quote where it's been said, and I would definitely agree, that if you go off of your nature alone and what you were born with, and the standards or lack thereof that you were born with, and if you're just going off of your natural impulse and inclination, you'll sink to the bar because of your environment, and you'll go off of that. So if you don't develop a conscious standard, and like be willing to swim upstream against the nature around you, or the nature that's being imposed on you, even,
that's a vortex.
You're gonna sink.
Yeah,
you're gonna sink.
You're gonna sink. I
right?
think that there's a vortex to that, and you see that in smaller communities. You see that in like island culture for sure.
Big time.
Like my wife Eden was born and raised in Hawaii, and everyone goes like, "Oh my God, living in paradise! It must have been so amazing." And like, there's a shadow side.
Lots of problems.
There's to that environment, and the number one that I see from my own experience, having spent a fair amount of time there, my dad lived there for a while, is there's this like vortex that happens when you're in such a small area like that. When you're on an island and there's only so much you can do and there's only so far as you can go, is it kind of washes right back on top of you, and so there's no really escaping that. And there's this kind of cloistering, you're always inundated with all of the stuff that you're constantly sitting in all of your stuff all the time, and it's washing back and hitting you in the face. And so if you're not equipped to really deal with it, then you develop some really shitty coping strategies.
That's why I had to leave the Midwest, and people tend not to leave the Midwest.
Big time.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't leave the island either. They don't leave their side of the island.
Ooh.
Yeah.
They like will stay on like the southern coast, and they're like, "Hey, so what's the north like?" They're like, "Oh, I've never been there." I'm like, "You're 35,
never been,
and you've never been to the other side of the island." They're like, "Yeah, why would I go over there? I got everything I need right here." It's like interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting.
Anything you want to add on that point?
I call it the Groundhog Day effect, where it's not every single day that you live the same experience, although it's pretty close in that timing. But to know people who have never left the island and have no idea or even...
do they have a desire?
Not even the desire to leave.
Right.
It's wild.
Well, I think that brings up a good point, and I can give an example of...
Speak your truth.
Want a peek
like,
into your
so I
life,
grew up
Chris.
in a town that was kind of like, it's like kind of like a twin city. It's Alcobendas and then San Sebastián los Reyes, so it's like two separate, but they're basically twin. And so it's, I think combined maybe 100,000 people, but I remember there's kids in my school that had like grandparents or something that had never left
the town.
the town.
Wow.
You know, like Madrid, they never been to like the city of Madrid.
Right.
You know, they just lived
Yeah.
in and out. It's like we're in like Berthoud, Longmont area. It's like never leaving Longmont.
Wow.
In your entire life.
Right. So where are your standards? Where are your morals? Where's your bar?
Yeah.
You know?
But that goes back to what you were saying of like if you don't develop it, and but I was thinking, you know, that's where like I always try to elevate it. That function of like it's really about the virtue, but it's not about escaping. It's about how to bring practicality of a more joy into your life, you know. And like I mentioned the first episode that, you know, my background in my personal development, spiritual life has been hermetics and Kabbalah, and in this case like hermetics. One of my teachers talks about, you know, like we have two natures and you kind of have to develop that one, and so
Like two natures, as in one
like
you're born
so
with,
like
and then one has
yeah,
to
so
come
you know
into
the
being.
way I understand myself and us humans is we're not physical beings having a spiritual experience,
Right.
but we're spiritual beings having a physical experience. And so this physicality is really important. It's a great training ground, but it's like what's the goal? What's the purpose here? It's joy. It's because there's standards that people are really heavy on, but they actually lead to more suffering. So that's where you got to discover if it's virtuous or not. And in the virtuous, will it lead to the improvement for the collective, the personal, and more? And what is that improvement? I would say some form of joy,
Quality of life.
or like quality of life. Like
Internally
it's like
and
it's like
externally.
love. You know, like if I love you, there's more love. It's not like a pie where I cut a slice out and now there's just
Less
3/4
love,
of the pie.
Do you love me?
I love all of
Could you
you.
learn to love me? Make an assessment.
And so
Make an assessment.
so yeah, and that's something that for me has been a principle which kind of is like related to virtues. Like And I know we have thought about a future episode around archetypes, and that's it's like
Yeah, we'll go
it's
into
like
that.
I always just bring the simple example of like, and this is what my 11th grade like English teacher, philosophy major was talking about was, you know, we always talk about a circle and we have an understanding of what a perfect circle is, but is there a perfect circle in nature? No. And so that's like the archetype.
You ever been to Pumapunku in Peru?
Okay.
No.
Maybe that's a perfect circle. I don't know.
It's perfect stone spheres that were carved by the indigenous population.
Not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens.
Yeah. Anyways,
Different
Wait.
episode.
I had to.
I want to circle back just because I feel like I had a little airplane moment of not understanding something. So when you were talking about the two natures of self, there was the human nature and the...
Is that our physical vessel, you know, we're experience through which we experience reality is this flesh, and so we have, and you know that happens, like you see it in Christianity. It's always like that struggle between the flesh, and so it's like you have these two wolves. Another metaphor.
Oh, that's such a great analogy.
And so it's like, you know, which wolf are you gonna feed? And so that's where, to me, the higher comes in. But in my own practical experience of life is that it's always, you're only going higher so that you can bring it down into and ground it, because otherwise it just hubba jubba mumbo jumbo
Abstraction.
sounds so cool. You can write 1,000 books on philosophy, but like, if it's not improving your quality of life, it's worthless.
And I really like what you said there as far as of honoring what it is that you're trying to bring in, and also what is the purpose of bringing it in. What are you trying to do? Because it also ties back to your analogy about the triangle, of like who sits on top of the triangle. Because if the purpose of the person who sits on top of the triangle is to develop their own power and their own greed and their hoarding all the resources and not doing it from that higher good type of perspective, when that's the mantle of the one sitting on the top of the pyramid, then it's not doing service. Like you're saying, it's like not actually bringing joy or purpose to what it is that mantle is supposed to hold. So then you were saying that then that would say that is lacking morality, lacking standards, lacking virtue, lacking those types of things, because you're hiding behind the shroud of the virtue signal.
Yeah.
Like virtue signaling that we're talking about right now too in our culture is really loud, and I think there's an important aspect of virtue signaling to say that this is something that I believe in. I'm a safe place for someone who also shares this virtue.
Yeah.
However, when it's a false flag operation, when people and corporations, like the thing kills me is like during Pride season.
Yeah.
Like, which for people who don't understand what Pride season is like, you know, the month of July when people who are part of the LGBTQ plus community gather together and just support being able to be alive and being out.
Inclusive. And,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's when corporations slap a rainbow on something and just try to like pay money to be in a float to sell product, to pander. It's pandering, really, what it is. But they're, quote unquote, virtue signaling, like, hey, here at this company, we stand for, like, where were you the rest of the year?
Exactly. I experienced that when I worked at, I'm going to call you out, when I worked at Fjallraven. I was very disappointed when I looked behind the scenes and I saw some of the marketing conversations about how can we angle Pride Month to sell more product and put rainbows on everything, and it was disgusting.
Right.
And that's why, going back to the privilege, I don't really have too much interest in talking about privilege, because it's just the words. Oh, I want to acknowledge that I'm this really cool person and you guys are trash because you were born into a poor community, and I said it out loud, so everything's good. It's like, no. How are you living? That
how
to
are
me
you
speaks,
embodying the virtue?
And like acknowledging like where you are in your place, because it doesn't matter where you are. You could start at the bottom, you know, pull up by your bootstraps in the U.S. or any other country's circumstance. You can be born into something. You can always rise above. Does it mean you're going to become the president of the world? Maybe not, but you can always improve. And I think that's what's more important. So it's like, I think sometimes when talking about privilege and those things and virtue signaling, you're almost amplifying the problem, because you're like, through acknowledgement, I'm that's enough. And it's like, it's not
Without
enough.
action, I would agree with you. I agree with you in without action, it's not enough. 100%. One thing I'd love to clap back with you, though, in that statement is, of course, as a white male, you don't want to talk about privilege. Like, of course, you don't want to have that conversation because it doesn't impact you. Like, you're not having the same level of impact that people of color or women have had to fight in a certain conversation. And so I'm not interested in having that conversation because it's like, no. Because you're not directly impacted by it.
Well, no, because it to simply put, every conversation around privileges will ultimately lead to, is my suffering more important than your suffering?
Not necessarily, because I agree with you that it comes down to action.
So why is a woman, in this case, a black woman's suffering more valuable than my personal experiences of suffering?
It depends if you're trying to negate whether or not she has suffered. Because it's the problem with the conversation, and again, this is a completely side topic, and we'll have a whole other conversation about it, but is when people who have the privilege tell the person who doesn't, why are we having this conversation? It matters to acknowledge it, and then the piece to that is to then act.
Shouldn't that person
forward.
also acknowledge? We should acknowledge each other, because I think it's about unity and creating bridges, because even the way you're framing it is essentially causing a separation, that you're saying there's this inherent separation that no matter how hard I try, just
there's definitely
due to
a bridge.
Circumstance,
There's definitely a bridge.
I'm inherently like have this. It's assumptive. It's like, oh, I'm assuming that because you're this way, you look a certain way, or you're born into a certain community, you're gonna be great.
Don't have the assumption. Don't make the assumption. But when someone of that ilk that I'm not a part of tells me something specific from their standpoint as true for them, the average individual will roll their eyes and not acknowledge it. And that's the point that I'm wanting to bring up about his privilege, is like when someone tells me, hey, as a woman, that was offensive, I can't go as a non-woman go, yeah, no, it wasn't. And that's the disacknowledgement
being
of
a shitty person, because
well,
it
that's
has
not
nothing to do
acknowledging the
with her being
privilege.
a
Yes, it
woman.
is. It's acknowledging the privilege that you have never had to have that thought in your mind, and therefore
So
you don't take offense to it.
Where does that leave people with equal privilege then? In their
Well,
disagreements?
this is my point of like when you're saying there is no bridge, I think there definitely is a bridge. And the bridge starts with acknowledging that there is a difference there. It's part of the conversation that there's a difference between masculine and feminine. There's a difference between people who were born in a lower income versus people who were born in an affluent income. They have different experiences, and both are valid. The problem is when someone tries to invalidate someone's experience. And either side, to just completely shut it down. So the bridge is the first step, is to acknowledge it, and then to have a conversation coming back towards the commonalities, coming back towards that unifying source that is all true for everyone. Yes.
Well, I kind of want to bring in this last piece as we have about 10 minutes left.
Perfect.
That is related to what you're both talking about, in the sense of like establishing morals is better than having none. So trying to create a bridge of acceptance and inclusivity is better than having nothing, because that furthers the separation. If that does that land or track?
I like tying it back into that, in that this is how this conversation or this topic for this podcast came up, is when Chris and I were talking about it, and I was advocating for more of the individually developed sense of morality versus having a starting block. Because I think that if you are force-fed, this is how you're supposed to be in the world, Patrick. This is how you dress. This is how you act. This is how you do that. Even if it's like seems off, or because of how hard line it is, it's very austere. This is where we were kind of having the debate, is like that your argument was that it was better, even if you were force-fed an austere environment, versus having it happen organically with nothing, because it's utter chaos and there is no form.
You were like, oh, bridge of acceptance, that's good, but what came to me is that if you accept everything, you stand for nothing. And like, then you'll never be able to actually rise above and like improve.
So I think the ground of this topic is the acknowledgement that we live in a culture that values individuality and the freedom of that individuality, but the price the impetus would be if you don't develop your own value system and framework of standards, you'll get pulled along by the lowest common denominator of the collective in this culture and time. So I would say we're positioned in a specific part of the world where like you really are encouraged to develop your own standards for your own reality. Otherwise you'll get swept around in, let's call it out, like consumerist culture. You know, that's sort of the ground that we're standing on. And if you want to have...
Specifically as Americans.
Specifically
That's
as
right.
Americans.
Yeah, our culture.
So, you know, not saying that's good or bad. Let's just say we might want something different. And in many ways, we will have to acknowledge that swimming upstream against the culture in many ways is a big part of that, and dealing with the consequences of like, hey, I don't value this as much as you do. I don't care about having a nice car as much as my neighbors do.
Sure.
And navigating that.
Yeah, I think having awareness for yourself, it comes back to self-awareness. And when we're talking about the bar itself is the denominator of which I think all of this measurement that we're talking about occurs. And the question that I have is for you both, and then I'll stop talking, is what is our individual responsibility towards upholding a quote-unquote higher standard in the effort to raise that bar? Is there one? Do we have a responsibility individually to try to live that more altruistic, virtuous life that is of our own choosing, against the surface narrative of what the society's telling me is okay? If society told me it's okay to go to a job interview in PJs and not brushing my teeth, and that was just acceptable, and where's my responsibility in showing up in looking and presenting myself in my highest and being in the best version of how I do my best version of myself? Where's the responsibility? Is there one? I'll pass.
I'll go first. I think that's where the illusion is that we can skirt responsibility. My understanding is that it's impossible to skirt responsibility, because even when you're on the lowest, what we consider so low that we almost maybe equate it with zero is actually still responsibility. And it's almost like a choice in a sense. So it's like,
It is a choice. 100%.
Ignorance is bliss, but like you actually eventually you can choose ignorance. Like there is willful
ignorance,
true
sure.
ignorant, and then it's like, you know, because I think in my experience, like reality constantly reflects back what your inner state is, right? It's like as within, so without. So if you are living by a certain standard, it's gonna you're gonna have all these experiences just living your life that it's gonna be like, okay, like I brought up, like whether your friend dies or like, and how you approach that. Like, do you have a moral compass, a virtue related to, you know?
Let's unpack that. Can we unpack that?
I don't know if we have time, but
I think
sure.
we do. It's our podcast.
We got about 4 to 5 minutes.
We have 15 more minutes if we want to. It's our podcast. We can do whatever we want. So, like, I would love to unpack that on a personal level. And if you have an example that you want to talk to, definitely please share. But use that as an analogy. So, like, I'll bring up a fact that about 2 or 3 years ago, one of my dear friends passed away. And it was during COVID. It was during a time period where, so I guess it was more than that. It was 3 years ago then. So relatively isolated. And it was really hard. It was my brother's best friend. And I was still really close with him, but not the same level that my brother was. But it hit me. I was having a conversation with my friend Nick, and he was over at a house that I was house sitting at. And I got the call from my brother letting me know that he had passed away. And it sat me down, and like I immediately started weeping, and it just hit me so hard. And then when my dad passed away, around the same time period, it was like within 6 months of that.
Within about a year.
It was
Wow.
still within
Yeah.
it was within a year.
That must have been really hard.
Well, the interesting analogy of that, or the piece that I want to talk to that, is like my dad's passing was like a long, like his decline was very long. It was like a 10-year decline. So it's like I'd witnessed my dad almost dying multiple times in my life, and it didn't hit me as hard in the moment. There's waves of grief. Grief comes in waves. But so to your point around like, so having a friend die and having moral compass or a reaction to it, what do you mean?
Well, that how you experienced it. Like, I think you got.
Where's the bar related to that, I guess, is really what I'm trying to draw.
I mean, maybe the friend dying is like a more extreme example.
Let's
but
go into the extremes though. Like, let's talk about it.
like you're gonna feel what you feel and you're gonna weep, but like if you have that like mindset around you got to be tough, then you're probably repressing something that's gonna cause you pain in your other relationships, and you're gonna see where it reflected. That it takes a level of self-awareness and like checking in with yourself. But like if you're like, oh, I'm not supposed to cry, like men don't cry, all that, like that could be your compass.
Sure.
And now your friend dies and you're really all you want to do is weep, and that actually be good for you. And yet you're like, no. And then so maybe you don't cry and you stick it in, and then you start, it's going to be amplified, especially when something big happens.
Catastrophic like that.
And so it's a good, I essentially boiling it down to your experience will show you, if you are willing to be self-reflective, whether your standard or morals are virtuous and lead to something that is supporting you versus not.
Yes.
I think in this conversation around the grief and bringing it to a more collective consciousness point of view with the bar, I think that in especially American society, there is not a lot of room for grief and death. And
in our culture, for sure.
especially in American culture.
And how we treat our elders.
And how we treat our elders, how we treat someone who is actively grieving, and we don't have a lot of compassion. And I think that compassion and care is something that changes the standard of the bar and raises and lowers that frequency.
Totally.
Whether we don't care or care too much can completely change the landscape of what we collectively experience as the bar.
Wow.
I think that that's a really good framework.
Compassion being a linchpin.
It really is a linchpin.
Wow.
Nice.
Wow.
It's like in the grenade of it all.
Great.
Of experiencing that, and I think that becomes a lot of people's definition of relativity to it. Because when we're talking about either privilege or experience or suffering or any of those things, it all comes back down, I think, to that level of compassion, to either extremes, right? I care too much or I care too little. And I think when you have those level of guiding, it's in my view, I think it's all about balance in everything in life. It's all about finding that balance, finding that neutral, finding that like centered. And if I'm living too much in a state of trying to save the world, or I'm living a nihilistic view of like it's all going to burn.
Everything's relative. Nothing matters.
Right. And it's just like, so if I'm falling back and on that spectrum of like not giving a fuck to giving all the fucks, like where do you find yourself? And I think that is kind of that level of bar, because we have on that spectrum, we have the bar sitting at a certain level. That is kind of the collective consciousness of saying, like, as a society, as a culture, as a whatever, this is what we deem as the level. And I feel like in the last several decades, we've watched a decline in that bar. Personally, from my vantage point, from looking at my own 38 years on this planet.
I wanted to ask you throughout this whole cast how much change you've seen in the bar.
I think it's dropped personally. And I'll pass it on to everyone else. Like, what do you think in your experience in your life? Have you seen an increase in that level or a decrease in that level? Not on a personal level, but as a group, as a collective. I think as a larger scale, I've seen a drop. On an individual, I've seen massive gains.
Can I offer my last thought?
Yes,
Cast?
please.
Closing
Yeah.
thoughts.
Closing thoughts.
am recognizing in my own life that I have found much more peace in terms of establishing my own standards and how that meets my external world when I internalize it. So if I have a vision at this point in my life for how I would love my world to be and where my joy is sourced from, and instead of efforting my way into trying to rearrange the pieces and convince the people around me of this is how the world should be, and offering my sense of morality and standard that way, I found a lot more joy and fulfillment in emanating my own vision of Shambhala or a higher world out into the field and allowing might not be strong enough when you're swimming up current, pressure testing with my reality of how can I offer my vision of standards and virtue to the world, and how do I need to adjust day by day versus the environments. I am privileged to be surrounded by amazing people where I don't have to push
as much.
Yeah. Whereas when I'm in different parts of the world, in different parts of the country, in different parts of the state, my expression of that has to change in terms of where my standards are at.
Adaptability, sure.
Yeah, and I love learning on that journey and
think
learning
that's something we all share
alongside
as journey,
all
yeah.
of you.
Yeah, it's
It's
beautiful.
been an honor.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
Closing thoughts, Chris?
Just like when you were saying about how to offer to the world, what hit me, I'm like, just live it.
Yeah. Be the example.
And so that to me is
Be your authentic.
sums it up.
Yes.
I'll live
Yes.
my bar, and that will be the testament to.
Do you think that there's a responsibility to do that, or do you think it's just intrinsic to your experience?
Yeah, and I accept.
Which you think there is a responsibility?
Yeah, and I do my best every day to accept that, and or remind myself that I've accepted it.
To living our authentic standards together.
Oh.
Be the light you wish to see in the world.
Love it.
Bring that which you want to seek. Yeah.
And that's it.
Thank you, everyone.
She
Thanks
wrote.
for tuning
Thanks.
in.